Hi all, I thought we could have another wonderful aesthetic experience looking at the sacrifices of Boris Spassky, and I've created a list of 8 sacrifices from candidates, about 30 candidates, to bring you these. The first one has actually been used in a James Bond film, From Russia with Love. If you remember that film, there was the game is actually based on this game I'm about to show you. Boris Spassky against David Bronstein, played in the USSR Championship, Leningrad, 1960. Spassky here played Queen d3, clearly lining up against h7, and David Bronstein tries to distract this battery by gaining a bit of time with e2. Now technically the best move is actually, it seems, checking with engines, to take here, but Boris Spassky plays something which gains arguably a bit of time, and it's been described by Soltis as one of the deepest sacrifices this side of the Evergreen game, the classic Evergreen game. Spassky played knight d6, so he unveils that battery on h7. So immediately white is threatening now a mate in 2 with check, and then check on h8. But of course the rook is hanging. Can't black take the rook? This is indeed one of black's best moves, apparently, or to take here. So what happened in the game was actually David Bronstein actually didn't take the rook. He played knight f8. They're both extremely dynamic, aggressive players. David Bronstein is a fantastic player in his own right as well, very imaginative, and has a classic work, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which I recommend to everyone to get. Now if he'd taken, apparently there might be a way of drawing this, and there's a separate video if you want to go and study that video for this game, which has very detailed analysis on this. But apparently there's a way for black to not be mated, so taking here gives the king e7, believe it or not. So we have this scenario where it's not entirely easy to mate the black king. It gets close like this, check, and it's very, very dangerous. Apparently black in this position has a resource knight e5, and although it's still very, very scary, bishop e6 here, and the engine suggests this is about equal. So, but in the game, in the practicalities of a game, so after this shocking move, knight f8, this actually gives white a significant advantage now. Can you see what Boris Spassky plays in this position? If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video now, what would you play in this position here as white? Okay, knight takes f7. It doesn't matter about e takes anymore. This is fine. It's all good for white. E takes is actually played. Check. Rook takes f1. So attacking the queen here. Now this is countered actually by the move bishop f5, counter-attacking white's queen. That's taken, and the point here is for queen d7 to try and remove some attacking pieces here to discourage white's attack. Boris Spassky is not wanting to exchange queens. He plays queen f4, and there's very, very dangerous threats now on this diagonal, such as bishop b3, or here this is potentially good, or just here attacking the queen for that f7 square. Black played bishop f6 here, and we have this knight coming to e5 to attack the queen and protect the other knight. Queen e7, and now this very, very dangerous diagonal, bishop b3. Note there's no light square bishop for black to counteract this light square bishop here, so it's very, very dangerous. Black played bishop takes e5. I'm not sure there's much better at this point. Maybe knight e6 slightly better, but bishop takes e5. Knight takes e5, discovered check, king h7, and now the final move, and as shown in the film, the James Bond film, can you see what white plays in this position and why it's so devastating? Okay, actually, any check here, Queen F5 or Queen E4 is very, very strong, but Queen E4 is played, and black has to resign. If, say, G6, then white has a knockout, rook takes F8, knockout blow here, so like this for example, knight G6, checkmate. Look at that wonderful bishop on the diagonal, stopping the king. That's just one example. If G6, if king H8, then again rook takes F8, and knight G6 check. And in fact we can win the queen with check, or even better, taking here for the checkmate like this. So it was extremely courageous thing to do, and in many of Spassky's games there's these kind of moves which seem to ignore the opponent's threats. So just accelerating white's ideas instead. So let's have a look at another wonderful game example, which actually echoes that principle, that sometimes you can really ignore the opponent's threats. Now this is from the classic USSR versus rest of the world match played in Belgrade 1970 on board 1. Actually, Bent Larsen was representing the Western world on board 1, Fischer on board 2. Bent Larsen had been more active than Fischer on the tournament circuit, so felt he should have been on board 1. Fischer didn't mind, he wanted to just play, so he accepted board 2. Spassky in this position played H5, and Bent Larsen played H3, expecting the knight to go back. And this, echoes the previous thing really. The opponent's threats, do they always need to be listened to? Well, you need to really know what you're doing to kind of disregard the opponent's threats. So the normal thing, which I think a lot of people would play, is just the knight retreat. You might consider a sack here as well. This might actually be okay as well, knight takes E3, because white's position isn't that good actually. But knight F6 or knight takes E3, these are interesting. But even more interesting in this move, and the engines absolutely love this move as well, it's got this soundness to it. If you haven't seen this, where have you been? I'll give you 10 seconds to see if you can try and find the move. So there's a clue here about ignoring the opponent's threats. So 10 seconds to pause the video now. Okay, H4, because really look, these guys are not out of base yet. The rooks here are connected and this one isn't, so we've got a disconnected rook, so we can actually hijack this H file potentially. This is now the principle of it, to allow H takes G for H takes G, and this is very, very dangerous, getting this H file for this check here, because that king, that is also an attacking unit now. So white is in big trouble. If, for example, taking, just to show that, then taking here is mate in 1 because of that pawn and rook. And this position is just terrible. It's just absolutely hopeless. As actually, if king F1, check, queen H4, and you see that H file, it's just hopeless for white because the rooks weren't connected. You can't defend that. So actually, after H takes G4, H takes G, Rook G1 was played, and this further magnificence continues. Absolutely magnificent looking move is played here. Might not technically be the strongest, but from an aesthetic point of view, I think it's one of the more aesthetic moves ever played, actually, in my opinion. Can you guess the next move for black if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Okay, Rook H1 is played. It's such a strong position for black that this is a big advantage. Also, bishop e3 first, then rook at h1 apparently is working quite well as well. But yeah, so rook h1 takes, and the idea is g2. So to get this queen h4, if the rook moves queen h4, so if rook g1, queen h4 is actually very, very dangerous here for queen h1. And you see again, these are not helping this poor rook on g1. It's an isolated island, that rook on g1. It's like white's position is lacking communication from the queen side to the king side. So actually in this position, desperate position here, the rook can't move like this without allowing the queening. So rook f1, and then we have this check, king d1. And again, it's demonstrated that white's position is so badly lacking communication that black can just take this now, and actually white resigned, because if bishop takes, then the absolute strongest, there's a mate in 3 now. The queen is eyeing e1, so bishop takes g4. And if king c1, this is ridiculous, but queen e1 is mating. Yeah, it was sometimes Bent Larsen, experiments with b3 on the first move, and it wasn't a particularly successful outing for b3. I think it was a b3 game that this came from. But magnificent h4, just disregarding opponent's threats, because he's got certain fundamental trump cards. So I guess you've got to really ask yourself, if you've got trump cards, is the opponent really in a position to make these threats? Do you really need to listen to them? Now, this is a lesser known game I'm going to show you in the next example. I found it quite magnificent personally. So this is one of the ones I built down from 30 candidates. White, this is in Germany, 1988. And there seems to be this idea that Boris Spassky was kind of not himself after the 1972 match. To be honest, the evidence I found, he was doing very well in USSR Championships after. And maybe the USSR, had given him a hard time. And, he had played a lot of chess, but he had a lot of brilliant years after 1972. And this game in 1988, for me, it's a touch of beauty here. c5, pardon me. White plays rook e2, okay? Rook e2. So that seems to safeguard the f2 square, because actually black's got some naughty ideas here regarding f2, like rook c3, to try and deflect the queen away from f2. So rook e2 safeguards f2. But now we see c5, and that actually threatens c4 to win the bishop. So white plays d takes c5. Now there's a kind of weakness of the last move, that this e5 square is now available for a knight. This knight's already pretty dangerous looking at that g2, but we have the other one now coming to e5, hitting the bishop, and that f3 square seems dangerous. The bishop moves, and can you see what Boris Spassky plays now? And I'm pretty sure, I don't know my slow computers, there was a flicker before they got it actually, but it's so cute, this next move. If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video now, what would you play as black? Okay, queen f3, and it forces white's resignation actually. It's a forced mate in 4. If g takes, knight e takes, because the knight's holding g2, so the king is forced to h1. And now, because of these knights, although they're close to the king, they can't actually help the g2 square concretely. They can help other squares, but not g2, because after bishop h3, how does white actually defend g2 against bishop g2 mate? And it's also, of course, blocking in the pawn. It's hopeless. White has to can delay things only by one move, ridiculous move. Otherwise, it's just mate next move. So say e4, bishop g2, checkmate. A wonderful little tactical sequence there, and it shows Boris Spassky. The years after 1972, he had some brilliant games. Okay, on to another example. Now, this was played in 1955, And it seems to me that you know, even from the 60s, he was a very dominant Russian grandmaster, one of the more aggressive, most feared Russian grandmasters. Even back in 1955. Now this opening novelty we're about to see, I think this was part of research that Black had been playing this G5 as a temporary pawn sack to try and get the E5 square with knight FD7, because positioning a knight on E5 is very attractive here. As an example, say White plays humbly with bishop E2, which is actually the engine suggestion, then HG, and this is actually potentially quite pleasant for Black, potentially, because there's, you know, dynamic activity of the pieces. But this important novelty, which has actually been talked about at length by Gary Kasparov on a video on YouTube, in this position, can you see what White played here? None of this humble stuff like bishop E2, but instead what was played, if I give you 10 seconds to pause the video. Okay, knight takes E6, taking that opportunity with the king in the centre to open up that dangerous diagonal. So we have F takes, check, King F8, and now a really beautiful point about this here is the F7 square. You don't want Black guarding the F7 square with a knight on E5. Or at least if the knight comes to E5, you want to be able to chase it away without it being reinforced by the other one. And because of that strange logic, you actually end up with this magnificent move, mysterious, to accelerate this idea of being able to coordinate a queen and a rook on F7. A magnificent idea here is played. If you want, I'll give you 10 seconds starting from now to pause the video. What would you play as White? Okay, bishop b5, so ready for a very quick castling with check and mating on f7. So if takes, well, it's not quite mating, but it's very, very good for White, this position here. So Black dare not take that. Black played king g7. Now we have castling, knight e5, and now bishop g3 to get rid of that knight, and the bishop here is lurking around to be able to snap this off if it tries to protect. So for example, knight bc6, we see the point of the bishop there, bishop takes, and say bishop takes, this is a forced mate in 5, for example like this, that would be a mate in 1. So that's the point, the bishop is really justifying itself now. Knight g6 is played, g takes, rook takes, and now deflecting the king away from h6 with check. Brilliant stuff, really. So the other rook is now ready to come into the game. Look at these guys. They're not in the game. So a takes, check, king e8, queen takes, getting some material back. So pawn situation, White is 2 pawns up but a piece down. Rook at f7, nasty pin. And now, after knight c6, another fantastic attacking move really is played. Knight d5. With that pin, how dangerous it is to take here. Let's have a look. E takes, there's queen takes d6. And if here, queen g6, now threatening this dangerous rook g7, for example, like this, just to give you an example, rook g7, check, check, queen g6, like king hunt there. So knight d5 really exposes the beauty of that pin for queen d6. So Black actually played rook takes a2. We have h3 safeguarding the back row for a moment. Queen h8. Now knight takes, knight takes. queen g5, check, queen comes to protect e7, but now queen takes b5 check, and now again this pin is exploited. Queen c5 check, bishop takes d6, so gaining back material with interest. Bishop takes e7. After rook a5, queen b4. White has such a crushing position here now. Black resigned. As an example, say the check is played, bishop d6, so we can't take this because of taking here is a mate. If here, bishop c7, so that's pretty hopeless. If here, we can just take here, winning material. So it's a remarkable opening innovation, this discussion about this positional pawn sacrifice, which at first was thought really clever, this g5 takes for knight fd7. But it does have an issue, which is amazingly exploited with this knight sacrifice. So back in 1955, these very powerful opening ideas were around. This next example was from the USSR Championship in Moscow in 1973, which demonstrates actually Boris Spassky was still a very, very feared grandmaster. He actually won this ahead of Anatoly Karpov and others. Still a very, very strong, dangerous grandmaster. Far from broken, as indicated by some sources, unfortunately. He was a truly great, dangerous grandmaster from the 60s to beyond the Fischer-Spassky match. So 1973, knight takes c3, played by Nukim Rashovsky. Now, if white humbly plays b takes c3, this does not really help the situation much. Although white might be actually okay, it's not ideal. Instead, accelerating white's ideas and ignoring the threats of the knight, we have queen g4, so letting the knight do its worst. So we have knight takes d1. Now the point is revealed here. Just calmly giving up a rook. Amazing stuff. But now, what does white actually play here? Well, knight takes e6 is played. Probably best, apparently, is for black to play this. So, if taking here, this is actually no good. Bishop d5, and black would be great, to take that bishop after. But in this position, bishop d6 is good, and the attack would continue. For example, like this, and bishop f5, and white is actually still doing very well, apparently. In this position, you can see the black king, it doesn't look good, the rooks don't look too good. Well, it's dangerous. It might actually be tenable for black with absolutely best play. But in the game, okay, f takes wasn't played. We have queen c6. Knight takes g7 check. So offering that bishop. So white with diminished resources plays check now. And the problem is the knight and the queen are beautifully coordinated in this particular position. If king f8, then knight f5, and we've got all sorts of threats. But the main one actually is involving e6 and queen e7 for mating that. This is too dangerous for black. For example, knight f2, e6. If taking, we can just mate like this, but e6 here is a crusher. It's actually a false mate. So this is a very, very dangerous position for black. After knight takes g7, king takes, queen g5 check. So king f8 wasn't played. We actually have f6 being played, and it doesn't matter. E takes, discovered double check, king d8. f7, discovered check, king c7. And now queen f4 check is played, and black actually resigns here. You might ask, well, isn't black loads of material up? Still 2 rooks, 2 knights and bishop. So he's got 3 minor pieces to white's 2 minor pieces and extra rook. So what's going on here? Why did black resign? Let's see. If king b6, then rook e6 actually wins the queen. The knight is actually usefully on g7 for rook e6 to win the queen here. And this knight's going to be lost after that, so it's not just winning the queen, it's the knight as well. The knight stranded, for example, like this. And this pawn's also dangerous. So this position, white is actually going to be up in material. So if queen d6, then here the killer move seems to be knight e6. And if king c6, we have bishop e4, we're going to be winning the queen. So that's not very, very helpful for black to play queen d6. So yeah, this is a bad position. If the king goes back, rook e8 check here, with that pawn mating, basically. Let's look at another example. This is Boris Spassky against his arch rival Tigran Bartanovich Petrosyan, played in 1969, Moscow. Queen d8. Petrosyan had played a very risky game up to this point, accepting a g-pawn and castling right into an attack, but it's up to white to prove the attack. Can Boris Spassky prove that he has a fierce attack against the very best defence here? Well, black is under fierce pressure on g7, on that g file, and there's pressure on the f file. Does this really constitute an absolutely winning position for white? Well, Boris Spassky proves it. He takes on e6 first, opening up the full wrath of both rooks. And now it's a case of removing the defender on f8. And an absolutely fantastic move to try and get to that defender is played here. Super powerful. And it's actually featured, this kind of move is featured in many of Boris Spassky's attacking games. Getting his pieces more options and more activity. The move, I wonder if I should let you guess it if I gave you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, a very powerful line opener, e5. It gives the e4 square for the knight, so d takes, and ignoring the threat here to accelerate white's attack, knight e4. So the idea is to remove the defender here on f8. If knight takes e4, then rook takes f8, and we finally got to remove the defender to crash through here. So this is under huge pressure now. Tigran Petrosyan finds knight h5 to try and stay in the game, protecting g7. Now, in this position, queen g6 is played. It's actually a very, very good position for white, and in fact the karma knight f3 is also apparently very, very strong. But queen g6, so white is threatening simply to take here and to carry on the attack. E takes d4, among other things. After e takes d4, a real crushing move now. Knight g5 is played, threatening mate on h7. And black is basically forced to give up the queen. If he plays h takes, then queen takes h5, queen f7. And although g7 is not the problem, a rook just swings in now calmly with rook f3 to threaten rook h3. And black's going to have to give up this queen to stave off mate soon. If g4, it's a forced mate in 4, just taking there's no defence after this. So this kind of characteristic, this is a trademark for me, looking at many of Spassky's game examples. This is a trademark break with the pawn as a prelude to very direct attacking play, giving that key e4 square to challenge that knight. So transferring this resource to be taking out a defensive resource is a very, very key idea. So achieving that with e5 is very instructive, I think. So another example now. Boris Spassky against Efim Geller played in the Spassky-Geller candidates quarterfinal match, Georgia, 1968. Rook c8 was played, and it looks like the knight's holding up h7, so that snapped off. Now if bishop takes, then that's immediately end of the game with check and a mate. So e takes is forced, and we have check, and now this is a beautiful point here that had to be seen. What does white play in this position? Really, really powerful stuff. If I give you 10 seconds to pause the video, what would you play in this position? Okay, knight takes f7. It means that the bishop can actually come to h6 soon. Or, in fact, the knight, now it's done damage, can come back for queen g8 as well. That's also pretty dangerous. So black played rook takes c2, and actually we have bishop h6. What does black do here? If he takes this bishop, then knight takes, threatening mate, is difficult to handle. Say here, funny enough, in this position, not queen f7, well, that's not as good apparently as knight g8. Funny looking move, knight g8, threatening mate. So that would be hopeless for black. You'd have to start giving up material. So this is really, really dangerous stuff. So black actually took on c1 with check, and then took this, and we have the king driven across the board. Queen takes g7 check. Now actually there's two very powerful moves, and apparently e5 is actually very, very strong here, but also g5 is strong, and that was one that was played. So threatening to get this pawn into the action. If taking here, then bishop takes on that e7 is very difficult for black to handle. Look at the queen over here. Very difficult to control these squares. So f5 was played. Now we have queen takes g6. Check. And the king doesn't really want to do this, because you can see that wouldn't be a good idea. So it goes over here. E takes f5. And now actually Geller resigned here. Let's see if he played on. If he played king b6, then these pawns are actually in mammoth proportions now. Just taking is good. These connected pass pawns would win f6, and this bishop's already lined up to win the rook there, so it's absolutely a winning position for white. We've got all these pass pawns over here. So a magnificent chase there. So starting from what looks like a kind of routine sack, then a kind of less routine sack with knight takes f7, and sort of not really going for the mate in the end. It's just, we can see that even though the king escapes, the damage has already been done. The passed pawns over here. Magnificent stuff. One last example of the 8 I'd like to show you today is a mysterious idea, a move in this position. Boris Spassky against Avian's Gypslis, played in USSR Championship 1961, the second one, part B of that year. There were two held that year. So this was in November, 18th of November 1961. Spassky played Queen h5, just ignoring totally queen takes e3 as a threat here. If queen takes e3 was played, then white should be okay actually with queen g5, not winning but okay with this continuation, because we're on d8 here. So black's best would be e4, and apparently this is equal. This position here is equal. But actually, black was tempted to play e takes d4, and we have a move which is very, very powerful in this particular position. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 10 seconds to pause the video here. Okay, rook takes g7. It looks as though for a moment the queen hasn't got that much support here. These guys are not doing anything, for example. This bishop's not really doing anything. Or is it? Well, in fact, the bishop's doing just about enough here. If king takes g7 was played, black resigned actually. If king takes, then actually rook c1 is the point. With the rook crashing through, thumping down on that 7th rank, would actually be winning. For example, like this. Check. Queen h6. And this is enough. You know, if takes, that's too much of a material loss. But even stronger than taking, just bishop takes d4 check, and this is really crushing this position. White's doing very, very well here. So yeah, this rook c1 idea accelerates getting to the 7th rank. It just seems to me a bit nifty that the queen didn't seem to have much support. You might wonder, could rook c1 have been played immediately? Well, actually, in this position, even though it might seem logical not to sacrifice any piece, actually the point was this bishop is actually quite dangerous. So queen b2 threatens mates here, and if rook takes a8, you see it's pretty hopeless for white in this position actually. There's nothing much going on. If this is tried, then there's nothing really, nothing's going on. So the only way is found really to break through. Rook takes g7 with this idea of rook c1. Amazing stuff. Shows great creativity and imagination, and often not kind of listening to the opponent's threats, having confidence in one's own trump cards of the position, to follow one's own ideas more than the opponent's dictation. I hope you enjoyed that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.